Hi, my name's Tonkiss. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and policy at Aston University, and I'm also a member of the chief team. This is a short presentation just to give you an overview of some of the major findings from the chief project and policy recommendations related to them. The presentation is based on our final policy brief from the chief project, and I provide a link for that at the end of my presentation. But the policy brief itself is essentially our cross-national brief. So where others we've had kind of individual country by country briefs, which are also available on our website, this brief really brought together all of our findings to think in cross-national perspective about delivering policy recommendations. And so that's what I'm going to be talking to today. To begin with, I want to give you a kind of sense of the overall policy recommendation and how that's embedded in what we've been finding on the chief project. So the chief project itself is grounded in the observation of well-documented challenges to minorities' rights and experiences of cultural diversity across Europe, and a view that it's important for government to acknowledge the value of culture and to invest in young people's cultural education. So really that was our starting point with the chief project. And the project itself has examined the processes and environments that influence young people's cultural literacy and identity. But we didn't just want to observe and investigate those from an academic perspective. We also had the aim of trying to change how cultural literacy is shaped and encouraged. And we've worked with a wide range of civil society partners so far to help us do that. But also, I think this policy roundtable really fits into that element of the project and thinking about how we can perhaps take forward some of the key findings and policy recommendations in a range of different ways. So through the chief project, then, we've noted a lack of understanding of young people's cultural identities and values by governments and cultural institutions, which has resulted in inadequate funding for young people's cultural education and representation as well. So, to enhance cultural literacy and identity and challenge intolerance, we've developed strategies that advocate for a more inclusive interpretation of Europe's cultural heritage as a foundation for cultural identity. And we've done so by working with a range of stakeholders across the 3 years in a number of different ways to try to think about how we might put in place those kinds of strategies. And so those of you who are attending this session who have perhaps worked with us in that time, hopefully some of this will be quite familiar to you. But also the ways in which we've developed those strategies have been written up, for example, in the national policy briefs, which will be available on our website. And where you can read about some of the things that we've been trying out in a bit more detail and some of this sort of specific recommendations which have arisen from those. Thinking about an overarching recommendation that emerges from the project then, our overarching recommendation is that government and policymakers listen to and engage young people in decision-making processes, as well as provide adequate funding to enable them to build relevant and fulfilling cultural engagement for young people. So that's the overall recommendation. And in the remainder of my presentation, what I'm going to do is to present some of the key findings which underpin that overarching recommendation, and then to dig deeper into that recommendation to pull apart a number of different recommendations that we're delivering to different kinds of stakeholders involved in the sector. Okay, so to begin then, to think about some of the findings that are underpinning that recommendation. The first key theme that emerges from our findings when we look at them in cross-national perspective is that overwhelmingly culture is very narrowly defined by particularly governments. So what we find is that culture and diversity are often understood in ethno-nationalist terms. So what this means is that the meaning of culture tends to focus on the meanings attached to it by the ethnic majority, and the experiences of minorities and the experience of diversity tends to be absent from definitions of culture. So this means that definitions can often be narrow and one-dimensional, so they can just focus on that one particular kind of culture and avoid the complexity which is bound up in the national identities that we find in Europe and beyond, but also that this understands ethno-nationalism and multiculturalism to be in tension with one another. And so really we get this sense of us and them and we against other that comes through in these kinds of definitions. So rather than understanding identity as something that can be inclusive and culture as something that can be inclusive of a range of different identities, including the ethnic majority, actually difference is seen as in opposition to ethnic majority culture. And again, that kind of overlooks the complexity of culture and the potential for it to be inclusive. And so while governments express commitments to cultural and social tolerance through cultural education programmes, they often fail to recognise the complex relationship between national identity and inclusion. And so what we really mean here is that government can often treat culture as something that's very settled and agreed upon. And this overlooks a lot of the complexity that actually underpins it and a lot of the diversity that underpins it. And what we're suggesting isn't really that we want governments to come to another kind of settlement about what culture is, but actually what we want is for government to be able to recognise the unsettled nature of culture and that it is complexity, that it is complex, and that complexity will never really be reconciled, and that that's okay, that difference will always kind of exist, and that complexity around culture will always exist, and that is really central to the idea of inclusive culture. So, and what we often see with regards to this is the conflation of inclusion with the integration of minorities into prevailing cultural norms. So what this means is, rather than trying to celebrate culture as it exists in the society, what we see is attempts to bring minorities into the majority culture. And again, that's what I mean by like trying to reach a settlement in culture rather than embracing the complexity that we find. And related to this, national narratives then often don't engage critically with difficult pasts, for example, of empire and colonialism. And so this limits then the recognition and participation of those whose histories are excluded, but it also misses opportunities to question those exclusionary views. And I think that's another example of overlooking the complexity of culture, and missing the opportunities that can perhaps be gained when we just embrace that messiness and complexity. So that's the first kind of overarching theme from the findings. The second overarching theme then is the idea of disconnected institutions. So what we find across our research in the partner countries is a disconnection between official discourses on heritage and the needs of young people. So we see significant discrepancies between the cultural activities which are made available to young people and what actually interests and matters to them. And this is also related to what I was talking about before in relation to kind of minority cultures and cultural diversity, because actually what we see is that the cultural experiences of the real cultural experiences of young people in their families and in their local communities aren't necessarily reflected in the cultural activities which are being offered to them. And so this is problematic. And it can underpin low levels of cultural engagement by many young people. And again, this is something we see across the board in our research. What we also find is that where young people's needs are being met, this is often by grassroots organisations and youth clubs. So this is the organisations that are on the ground. They might be sort of semi-formal organisations, or actually they might be very informal organisations. But they're playing a really key role in delivering cultural activities to young people that are actually meaningful to them, that actually speak to their cultural identity, their experiences and their heritage, but also just to their interests as well. The problem here is that public funding is often targeted to large institutions that represent the high culture, perhaps, of the ethnic majority. So the example I always come back to when I'm describing this is in the UK, a lot of funding is devoted towards Shakespeare. And that's an example of a kind of particular form of ethnic majority high culture in the UK, where funding is heavily targeted towards, whereas we might find the organisations that we were working with, which were quite informal, or at best semi-formal, really struggle for funding. So one organisation, for example, that I worked with in the course of the research, during the winter, going to their meetings, I had to wrap up really warm because they couldn't afford to put the heating on for their activities. So there's what we see is this big discrepancy in terms of where young people's needs are being met and then where funding is really being targeted. And what we also see is a lack of appreciation for young people's engagement with online and digital spaces, and in particular social media, which we know is a really important part of young people's lives, and again is something that we've talked to young people about on the project. And what we've found is that there's a real need for cultural institutions to look to engage young people through the creation of online and digital spaces that might take them beyond what they've traditionally done, but which are arenas within which young people are very active and are more readily ready to engage in cultural activities. And so we think that, you know, what we're seeing here is disconnection between these kinds of cultural institutions and young people. Okay. Moving on then, the third kind of key theme from the findings is what we see in relation to barriers to participation. So I alluded in the previous slide to some low engagement in relation. Oh, I can't go backwards in this. I just tried to go back to the preceding slide. What we see is that low engagement in relation to that disconnection with institutions. But I want to talk in more detail, I think, in this slide about some of the barriers that we see overall in the kind of across the partner countries. So what we see is that racial, religious, gender and disability-based inequalities hinder participation in cultural activities and access to cultural resources. And again, we see this across the board in the chief partner countries that we've conducted research in. We find that all of these different kinds of inequalities really impact on participation in cultural activities. We also find that family and socioeconomic status can significantly limit young people's access to cultural opportunities, that these things make a huge difference to the extent to which young people engage with cultural opportunities. What we also find is that culture tends to be seen by government as an expense rather than investment. And what this means is that cultural activities are left undervalued and under-resourced, and young people simply without opportunities and choices. And what we find is that there are limited opportunities for young people, particularly those from diverse ethnic and socio-cultural backgrounds, to participate in decision-making processes for the allocation of resources to cultural institutions and activities. And that really matters, because when I come back to what I was saying about the earlier slide about disconnected institutions, really the best way in which to connect with young people is to have them involved in those decision-making processes, to find out what it is that matters to them and interests them. But crucially, in order for us to move beyond this narrow definition of culture, that has to embrace young people from diverse ethnic and socio-cultural backgrounds. And that's something that we're not seeing at the moment. And I think that's kind of doubling down those barriers to participation. And so that's something we really come back to in our policy recommendations around bringing young people into decision-making processes, in addition to providing adequate funding for those opportunities as well. And so the kind of final thing that I want to really say then about the key findings relates to formal educational institutions. So for example, here I'm talking about schools. What we find in relation to schools, and we've done a huge amount of research into schools, again, you can find more information about that on our website, but what we find is a lack of promotion of cultural diversity in school settings. So school curricula often don't reflect the lived cultural experiences of pupils' families and local communities. Again, that relates, similar theme to the kind of disconnected institutions that I was talking about earlier. We recognise that in many settings, school curricula are beyond the control of the educational institutions, and that actually this is again kind of something for government to take on board. But there is a need, we believe, for reform of curricula to better reflect those lived cultural experiences. We also found a lack of provision of diverse cultural activities, both in school and through extracurricular visits to cultural heritage sites. What we found was that this was particularly problematic in rural areas. And what we found was that in some contexts, opportunities may be very unequally dispersed across different educational pathways. So this will apply in certain countries more than others, but where there are different kinds of educational pathways, what we found is that some really emphasise diverse cultural experiences, whereas others don't so much. And what we also found is this big discrepancy in kind of urban and rural areas. So people living in urban areas where there might be more diverse cultures, there might be more diverse heritage sites available to visit. We see a greater kind of emphasis on engagement with diverse cultural activities, whereas in rural areas, typically there wasn't so much. And so this is more problematic in those areas. And that's also true when we come to look at intercultural contact. So this lack of provision is further problematised in the least diverse localities, for example, often rural areas, where opportunities for intercultural contact in school are also limited. And we did find in some instances racism and discrimination in schools being normalised with no recourse to complaint and no training or other support for school leaders and staff. And so this really informed our policy recommendations in this area. Moving on then to our policy recommendations to finish. So we sort of have 3 sets of recommendations. So the first is to policymakers and decision makers. And so we recommend that they adopt a broad and inclusive definition of culture as plural and complex, that they bring multiple stakeholders into the cultural policy planning process, including those from underrepresented groups and, of course, young people, that they ensure relevant non-formal and informal organisations are officially recognised as providers of cultural learning activities, and that they have sustainable funding, that they adopt equity as a primary objective of cultural policies and work to implement programmes that can mitigate the impact of wider inequalities, and that they create potentially, if my sort of later recommendations, findings regarding formal educational institutions apply, that it might be relevant to create a commission for formal education providers to address gaps in curricula and to challenge discrimination through anti-discrimination training. To cultural institutions then, and again, when we're talking about cultural institutions, of course, we imagine policymakers being involved with these with delivering these recommendations in partnership. But we recommend that they should encourage interethnic dialogue by opening up cultural institutions to difficult pasts and critical discussion of exclusionary views. That they expand and diversify approaches to culture and heritage to include local, regional and diasporic cultural traditions. That they identify local, regional and national cultural opportunities in partnership with providers across a range of different settings to shift away from that dominance of high culture that I alluded to earlier. And that might kind of involve like a mapping exercise to identify what the providers are here, and to work in partnership with them. To synchronise cultural activities with young people's identities and interests, including the digital space, in partnership with young people themselves and relevant youth workers, and to work with policymakers and decision makers to really try to create policies which can mitigate the impact of wider inequalities on access to cultural institutions, and that's across physical and digital spaces as well. Our final set of recommendations then, again in partnership with policymakers, is for formal educational institutions. We recommend that they build recognition of young people's lived experiences and cultural knowledge into the curriculum and everyday school life. We recommend that they reform curricula to ensure that cultural education is embedded across subject areas and that it's accessible to all young people, and also that appropriate training and support is provided to all staff in order to deliver that and in order to take forward an anti-discrimination agenda within school. And we recommend that they create opportunities for intercultural encounters to facilitate learning about commonalities and differences, which again can be developed through training and support for staff. So there are more detailed recommendations. Now you can read more about what I've said in our policy brief. It's policy brief number 4, and it is available at that web address which is on the screen now. You can find more detail about that. If you would like any more information about the policy brief, or if you have any difficulties finding it, you can just drop me an email. That's absolutely fine. Again, my email's on the screen now. Thanks ever so much for listening. I'm really hoping for an interesting and lively discussion at the policy roundtable.